Thank you for the invitation to contribute to this webinar on understanding parenting today. Parenting presents many challenges, and I'm going to discuss one of the earliest, which is agreeing an infant feeding plan that meets the needs of the infant and with which the parents feel reassured and confident in delivering. Despite it being universally acknowledged that all infants should be breastfed from birth, the WHO targets for exclusive and continued breastfeeding rates clearly are not being met. With the driver for breastfeeding being to support the health and well-being of the infant, it is inevitable that parental decisions on initiation or cessation of breastfeeding may generate deep emotional and psychological dilemmas for mothers. From the data on non-compliance with WHO recommendations, it is postulated that there are many mothers who may consider that their infant feeding experience was highly sensitive, emotional, and potentially traumatic. This presentation begins by briefly describing our recent systematic review of parent attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions regarding infant feeding, and considers how the parental voice of reason can make a valuable contribution to defining a more sensitive and rewarding infant feeding experience for families. The study was a collaboration between colleagues from Nestle Nutrition and contributors from Brazil, United Kingdom, and China, and was published in the journal Behavioral Sciences in April 2020. The aim of the study was to provide a comprehensive synthesis of original qualitative data that informed on parent attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions with regard to infant feeding, and also to identify factors that influence parent-infant feeding decisions, and to include just recent studies published between 2015 and 2019 to provide current parent perspectives of infant feeding. The systematic review follows standard recommendations, and following the initial search and assessment process, 73 papers were included in the review. More than half of the studies were published in the past 3 years. A majority, 82%, of the studies were conducted with parents from North America, Europe, United Kingdom, and Australia. A limited number of studies included parents from Asia or Africa, and the data was obtained from focus groups and interviews. You'll see the number of papers and international distribution of these papers indicate that parent attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions relating to infant feeding are of global interest and also of concern. The key findings from the systematic review were as follows. The evidence indicates that there are many mothers who feel overwhelmed, anxious, and frustrated with the intensity and unpredictability of breastfeeding, and found that breastfeeding was demanding, not as easy as it should seem, and required perseverance. Many mothers who breastfed reported negative feelings of judgment from others, and several identified stigma, shame, and personal embarrassment to feeding in public. There are also mothers who exclusively breastfed or breastfed for longer durations than typical for their culture, who have high internal perceptions of confidence and determination with their breastfeeding decision. And despite challenges, they reach their goals. Alternatively, there were many mothers that could not or elected not to breastfeed, particularly for the duration they intended, and they reported feelings of shame, guilt, or stigma. The idealism that breastfeeding was representative of a good mother, not surprisingly, created conflict and raised discussion on a woman's self-perception of what it means to be a good mother. Overall, the influence of a mother's immediate family or her infant feeding decisions and behaviors had a strong impact, but advice from family was often contradictory to nutrition-based feeding guidelines. Similarly, family, tradition, and culture shape parental infant feeding beliefs and perceptions on the introduction of complementary feeding. Finally, a need for strategies and support that address parents' personal, cultural, and ideological constraints with infant feeding were identified in several studies. To support this qualitative data from our systematic review, this paper by Fallon and colleagues provides quantitative data from a study undertaken in the United Kingdom. And this gives an indication of the potential magnitude of emotional and psychological burden that can be associated with infant feeding choices. If we look at the column headed EBF to EFF, you will see that 79% of the participants who changed from exclusive breastfeeding to exclusive formula feeding experienced feelings of guilt, and they also, 75%, experienced feelings of being stigmatized. If we look at the column EFF, you will see that the feelings of guilt were less, with 45% of participants feeling that sensation, whereas a very high level of stigmatization was maintained in this group. The main source of guilt and stigma were from other mothers, health professionals, and also what they read on the internet. Both groups reported that the majority of mothers needed to defend their choice of feeding. But interestingly, you will see that in the exclusive formula feeding group, the vast majority of mothers were satisfied or very satisfied with their decision to formula feed, whereas in the exclusive breastfeeding to exclusive formula feeding group, the feelings of satisfaction were less convincing. The first 1,000 days, which refers to the period from conception to 2 years of age, is recognized as a critical time for nutrition, growth, and development. And this underlines the importance of infants receiving the right food at the right time during this period. There is a universal consensus regarding the right food, but issues relating to the right time are heavily debated and been in conflict over several decades. And this has led to inconsistent messages for parents. In infant feeding policymaking, there is an increasing tension between idealistic and realistic approach. The left column represents the WHO recommendations that are currently in operation today, and the right column reflects WHO recommendations that existed pre-WHO infant feeding strategy that was published in 2003. The dilemma is that does more ambitious idealistic approach leads to significant health gain, but risks less compliance, or does a more realistic approach provide less health gain, but achieve greater compliance? Or is there a middle ground with components from each of the approach forming a middle road that makes acceptable exceptions on both health gain and compliance? Ideally, this would be tested by an RCT, but randomizing mothers and their infants to different durations of breastfeeding presents ethical considerations. There is therefore depends upon observational studies, which are subject to confounding variables, and interpretation of data is then subject to individual opinion and consequently mixed messages for parents. To achieve a resolution that could possibly enable a consensus of opinion, effective engagement with all of the key groups is essential. Effective policy requires transparency and accessibility to as wide a range of citizens as possible. It's important to reach out beyond the usual suspects, to avoid the risk of policy being hijacked by the vociferous few, and to communicate with the silent majority. Compliance with infant feeding policy requires consensus from parents, and consensus from parents requires consultation with parents. Consultation with parents needs to be a two-way exchange, with parents hopefully learning from you and you always learning from them. It is critically important not to underestimate the natural instincts and common sense of parents. And this is especially relevant in the management of nutritional health and well-being of their infants and children. Parental intuition and unconscious reasoning needs to be balanced against the conscious reasoning contained within official guidance for policy and practice. It is also important to appreciate that health messages need to be proportionate and receptive to the target audience. If inappropriately delivered, health messages can result in the target audience adopting behaviours opposite of the recommended action. The theoretical framework for this boomerang reaction has been called psychological reactions theory, which was described in 1966. Recent studies involving young adults showing that highly explicit directive language is often viewed as controlling may contribute to higher levels of psychological reactions and thus higher levels of anger and a negative perception of the credibility of the source. The use of more implicit autonomy supporting and encouraging language has been shown to diminish reactance arousal. More implicit messages using qualifier terms such as perhaps, possibly, and maybe reduce levels of reactance, whereas language that is controlling may include forceful verbs such as ought, must, and should. It is noted that in the WHO code, should is mentioned 96 times, and perhaps, possibly, and maybe are not mentioned. An interesting example of psychological reactance relates to recent changes in the definition of breast milk substitute. The term breast milk substitute was created by policymakers and is ignored by parents. I've consulted with thousands of parents over the last 30 or more years, and not once has a parent said to me, "Oh, by the way, doctor, I've started my child on a breast milk substitute." Breast milk substitute is defined in the code as any food being marketed or otherwise presented as partial or total replacement for breast milk, whether or not suitable for that purpose. In 2016, WHO stated that a breast milk substitute should be understood to include any milks or products that could be used to replace milk, such as a fortified soy milk, in either liquid or powdered form, that are specifically marketed for feeding infants and young children up to the age of 3 years, including full-up formula and growing up milks. This new statement from WHO certainly meets some of the criteria for psychological reactance, with commanding language should be understood. The validity of the statement is dependent upon WHO recommending that mothers should breastfeed for 3 years. And for many mothers, this will resurrect their feelings of guilt and stigmatization, and in some feelings of anger. WHO stated that this is not a change to the definition, but it is a clarification. These are extracts from letters published in a UK national newspaper, and they represent the opposite ends of parental perception in relation to their experience of infant feeding. The first relates to a mother who had difficulty in maintaining breastfeeding and had support from a lactation consultant to whom the letter was addressed. The second extract was from a female doctor and mother of 4 children who encouraged mothers to do what they think is best for their child. I felt incompetent. I didn't have much time to enjoy him. My milk supply didn't increase. So I quit breastfeeding. Today I'm a happy stay-at-home mum who spends my days feeding my baby, playing with him, doing his laundry, reading to him, and enjoying him. The long days at home as my baby's primary caregiver did give me the time I needed to figure things out. And for me, that meant switching to a bottle. I don't regret it. And then we have the view, making personal choices on rational grounds is part of being an adult, and definitely part of being a parent. Perhaps sensible mums will check out the pros and cons, ignore the pressure groups, and do merchants. Face the realities of the situation, stop being bullied by ideas of perfection, and just get on with it. And so from this presentation, I believe there are a number of potential messages from parents to policymakers that have been identified. Policies need to be viewed by parents as achievable. What is achievable will differ across families. The psychosocial consequences of overreaching targets are not only a disincentive, but may also be physically and emotionally harmful. The extremes of idealistic, wishful thinking and the harsh reality of coping with a newborn infant need to be coalesced into workable solutions for individual families. A balanced incremental approach to policy and practice may allow the development of a greater sense of ownership and confidence, mitigate the sense of overwhelming pressure and failure, and redefine what is a successful breastfeeding experience. Thank you.